Hi, Matt.
How are you doing?
Good, thank you. Great.
Good. Well, I think we'll try and kick off at a punctual time. Hi, Charles.
Hello.
Hey. So, if I think for the start, we'll introduce you and give a bit of a brief overview of the book, and then after a few minutes of that, we'll open the floor. If that's all right.
Sure.
So I thought the first thing. So Tom, for those who don't know, used to be the Lib Dem MP in South London, and now is the director of Unlock Democracy, as your Zoom name suggests. My first question today marks 3 weeks until polling day. Do you miss campaigning? Are you glad to be shot of it?
Well, it's clearly a lot easier for me to grow my hair, as you'll have seen I've done outside Parliament than it would be within it. But more seriously, I suppose if there was any time to lose your seat, probably a year or two in which COVID had completely destroyed most of Parliament's activities and meant that the sort of things that members of Parliament will do in terms of meeting constituents, going to events, talking to local businesses, sitting in Prime Minister's question time and challenging the Prime Minister in a sort of raucous, challenging environment. None of that is happening. So I guess if there was a time to lose, then this might have been it. And it's given me the advantage of becoming director of an organisation which, to a great extent, campaigns on many of the things that I used to campaign on as a member of Parliament. So the role hasn't changed that much. And what I do find, at least in this role, is that I have some of my weekends to myself. In a way that as a member of Parliament it's not just for 22 years as an MP, but the 7 years prior to that campaigning to get elected,
right.
There wasn't much spare time. So I do enjoy having a bit more time with the family, and indeed having the energy and being able to stay awake long enough to read a nice chunky book Jeremy's things.
It was a chunky book. My last question, just before we get to it, would you mind just telling everyone in a few words what you do currently do at Unlock Democracy?
Yeah, so Unlock Democracy, for those of my generation, will remember Charter 88, and Unlock Democracy is the successor organisation to Charter 88. Charter 88 and therefore Unlock Democracy was set up to campaign for a written constitution for the UK. And that is what we are still campaigning for. And I would argue that in the last couple of years, the need for that has become even greater. We've seen an attempt to close down Parliament. We've seen a government that was willing to entertain breaking international law. We've seen the devolution settlement and indeed local government, central government settlements significantly eroded by central government as we see the UK becoming increasingly centralised. So Unlock Democracy's role is as important as it ever was, if not even more important, because of what's happened in the political sphere in the last couple of years.
Well, I'm sure with that short pitch, we'll all be signing up to your mailing list.
I hope so. We're very cheap to join.
Well, let's jump to what does Jeremy think. So why this book? Why was this your first go-to choice?
Well, I mean, first of all, it was a book that had been widely trailed. It was a book that covered a period where sort of which overlapped my period of activity in politics. So this book really kicks off in 1992. That from sort of Black Wednesday onwards, and I first started getting really involved in politics in 1990, and it runs through until the Theresa May government, including the period in coalition when I was a minister for 3 years in coalition government. So it covers the period that I was most politically active in. but also it does it from a slightly different perspective than the usual biography or autobiography of a politician, in that this is a civil servant who was there in the thick of it in terms of political action, but there is a civil servant who had to work with a succession of different governments. So the Tony Blair government, the Gordon Brown government, the coalition government, Theresa May government, and had to act as a conduit sometimes between, in the coalition's case, the two coalition parties in the coalition. In the case of the David Cameron's government, act as a conduit between the different factions within the Conservative government, so the pro-Brexit and anti-Brexit. So it's a different perspective on politics, and also because it was written by his wife, Suzanne Heywood, it also has a very personal side to it, which touches on the difficulties they were having with IVF treatment, through to the last few months of his life, where he was clearly in a great degree of pain. So it has a number of different facets to it that you don't necessarily find in autobiographies or biographies of politicians.
No, and I really like the personal side of it. I have to confess, I only just finished. I finished it in the closing minutes before we started. So Jeremy has just passed away about at 5:25, and I realised to what extent I'd got to really like the as he's presented. And I felt I'm suddenly sort of reeling in the loss, but feels quite silly to say that. Had you met Jeremy, Tom, in your? I
don't think I probably did meet him, but not on a very close-up basis. But certainly I exchanged correspondence with him, and I must say got frustrated on occasions, because typically the sort of thing I was corresponding with him about was what I alleged were breaches of the ministerial code by a series of government ministers, but he never quite saw eye to eye with me on those issues. But I guess what comes across from the book is that he was quite balanced in the way that he treated politicians of all parties. He knew his role as a civil servant was to ensure that his decisions were impartial, even though there were, or non-political, even though there were some really, really challenging political dilemmas that he faced, particularly, in fact, not so much around the coalition, because his description of that was that it worked fairly well, and there wasn't too much tension, but particularly
Davey out of his office.
Sorry?
Apart from locking Ed Davey out of his office when it
well, indeed, yes, or not finding one for him at the beginning that was suitable for him. But the difficulties that he faced, particularly around the Brexit referendum, with keeping Conservative ministers who are pro and anti on board and able to continue to operate as ministers when they had alternative positions on that fundamental issue that the government had an official policy on, which was to be in favour of Remain, or at least the Prime Minister's position was to be in favour of Remain.
Can I ask, it's a question I wondered, sort of bringing together your current work, sort of around the electoral integrity bill. Could we ask now, what, is it a question policymakers are in around Whitehall are still going to be asking, imposing each other? I wonder if people are going, what would Jeremy think? And is this and perhaps it can be applied to the electoral integrity bill. Where do you think he might stand on this?
Well, I would hope that, clearly there are still any number of politicians who are active in politics who have had contact with him. And I think that is one thing that comes across in the book, that not only was he there between 1992 and 2019, but so was David Cameron. So, David Cameron was there as Norman Lamont's advisor at the point when Norman Lamont had the misfortune of his basement flat being occupied by Mrs. Whiplash, who gave sort of correctional procedures to naughty boys, through to the fact that Ed Miliband and Ed Balls and David Miliband were all advisors in the Blair government. So a lot of the key players are there throughout, and have emerged later on in politics and continue to do so, continue to play a role. So Theresa May, I'm sure, may well be asking, as a sort of politician who is still there, what would Jeremy think on some of the issues that she is facing. But I think one of the things that Jeremy tried to do, as comes across in the book, is that he tried to ensure that his values were ones that were replicated throughout the civil service. So, the fact that he has passed away doesn't mean that there aren't a generation of civil servants who listen to him, listen to his belief in the civil service in the United Kingdom being the best in the world, or certainly according to some measures, one of the best in the world. So hopefully it's not just what does Jeremy think, but it's also what does Sophie think, what does Raj think, and what does a whole host of other civil servants who have been trained in effect by him and absorbed his values, that our politicians should be asking questions of now.
Okay. So I'm going to open the floor here to other people. Jump in with your questions, if sort of as they come to you. Can I just ask, as a book, obviously you have an affinity to what happened in the course of events, and you had the overlap. What did you make of it? How have you enjoyed it? Have you finished it? Have you?
Yes, I mean, like you, I didn't finish this at 5:25, but I must admit I did go to bed for an hour and a half early this afternoon, just to make sure that I had finished it. So yes, and I was making notes as I went along. So no, I really enjoyed it. I think it's a good sort of history of what happened between the early 1990s and just a couple of years ago. And what comes across in the book is the different crises that he personally was involved with. It has been a very, very busy period in our history, from sort of Black Wednesday, which I mentioned, through to the incoming Blair government, the battles that were already happening just a year into that government between Blair and Brown, with briefing and counter briefing, foot and mouth disease, expenses scandal, Iraq war. All of these are things where Jeremy Heywood was there at the centre of it, trying to find a way forward, trying to bring forward a compromise if there were conflict. And he has played a very significant role in our recent history. And that's why I think at his funeral, we had Tony Blair, Gordon Brown, David Cameron, Nick Clegg and Theresa May present, because they recognised how central he has been to government, and the fact that you had three different parties represented there indicates that he was able to, as a civil servant, get accepted as someone who was above politics, that people could trust, even if he had previously served a different leader from a different political party.
And can I ask, if we can be a bit nosy then about the goings on of the coalition? He certainly had his frustrations with Ed Davey, who is obviously now the leader of the Lib Dems, but then he was the minister for energy, trying to get increase the uptake of renewable energy and not have the government renege on its green promises. And I get the feeling that reading through, I felt that Jeremy was the Conservatives. He seems to have gone in much more with the Conservatives in that coalition agreement, and than he did with the Lib Dems. Was there a sense that he was part of the more or less number 10 team? Was there a sense that this team of civil servants were supporting the government, i.e. conservative agenda and less so the Liberal Democrat agenda?
No, I don't think that's the case. What, where the clashes tended to happen was between a Liberal Democrat minister and a Conservative minister in the same department. And the best example of that, if you remember that one summer holiday, Michael Gove announced that GCSEs, I think, were going to be scrapped and he was going to reintroduce O-levels.
Yeah.
Well, that was something that came out of the blue, hadn't been agreed, and David Laws, who was the other minister in the senior, Michael Gove was the senior minister, David Laws was the next in terms of seniority, and kicked up rightly a big stink about that, and Michael Gove had to do a U-turn. So it was more at that level that the clashes happened. Another example would be the relationship with the coalition as a whole had with the Home Office. The Home Office being, of course, Theresa May, where that was a department that probably of all the government departments, the department that probably as a result of its leadership in terms of ministers, felt that it was a Conservative government. It wasn't a coalition government.
Yeah.
And hence the story, I'm not sure whether that one emerged in the summer. I think summer, when people are away, probably is when people like to spring things. But I think the vans that went around saying, call this number if you want to, if you want to report someone to get them sent back to where they came from. That was a Home Office initiative that was launched without coalition agreement. And that relationship with the Home Office and Theresa May in particular was never one that operated very well. And in contrast, for instance, the relationship that I had, so in the last 3 years of the coalition, I was Deputy Leader of the House of Commons. And for the first year and a half, Andrew Lansley was the leader. So he was, in some respects, my boss as the Leader of the House of Commons. And we worked together very closely. I never felt he was trying to pull the wool over my eyes or spring things on me. And the leader for the last year or so was William Hague. And again, I never felt that he was trying to pull a fast one. We worked together, we shared things, we shared information. So it was really the clashes that happened weren't with civil servants, they were with ministers, and it was with a small number of ministers, Michael Gove and Theresa May in particular, being ones with whom the relationships were very difficult.
Well, let me just say again, any questions for Tom, do put them in the chat, raise your hand, or just take yourself off mute and blurt aloud. It's, it's not too, we're never too formal about this. I had one other question I just wanted to ask before we jumped in. And before, I'll ask this one. Normally we wait till the end. And Tom, do you have any other books you might recommend that you're managing to squeeze into your Sunday evenings or midday reading sessions?
Well, I wouldn't necessarily recommend the book that I've got my laptop on, which is Mandelson, the biography. But another book that I've got close to hand is a book by Catherine Belton, which is called Putin's People, which is about the research that she's done into how President Putin basically took over and the people around him took over from, obviously he was in the KGB, then the Soviet Union collapsed, there was that period of complete chaos, but he managed to survive in terms of, and the KGB network that he was part of managed to survive that period and then entrench themselves, and then what he did thereafter. But also it flags up some quite interesting connections between people who are now prominent donors to the Conservative Party, who, if you look up, for instance, Mr. Temerko, in the index of her book, you will find a number of references to him. He is now a British citizen and quite a significant donor to the Conservative Party, but he has quite a few mentions in the book that are worth reading. So that's something that I would certainly recommend.
Well, that will have to go on the summer or autumn reading list for this group then.
It's a chunky book as well.
Well, then we might give our readers a bit more of a heads up. So, and how is it then to find everyone you've worked with to become a footnote in a book like this, to read a book which occupies the world all around you? You know, how is it to be one of the players now on the page?
Yeah, I think one interesting aspect of it is the different perceptions that are in the book about certain events compared to the ones that I had, or at least the different emphasis that was placed on things, which I guess is inevitable. But for instance, the G20 conference in London in 2009, where understandably Jeremy Heywood's focus and that of the government was on trying to ensure that the global financial markets survived and that we didn't enter into a period of deep recession or depression. That is what is reported in terms of Jeremy Heywood's book. My recollection of the G20 is different, because I attended the demonstration at Mansion House as an official observer and ended up being kettled by the police for 5 hours, and then having some lively exchanges on the Home Affairs Select Committee, which I was a member of, when we discussed with the senior police officer, Superintendent Broadbent, who is in charge of the G20 protests, when we had him in front of the Select Committee, and he was answering questions in a way that I knew was untrue, because I was there, I was in the middle of it, I could see what the police were doing, and the police were not doing some of the things that he alleged that they were doing. And so subsequently, well, I was astonished that without full knowledge of the facts, that the police were saying, for instance, that I got a categorical assurance that there were no undercover police officers in the crowd during that demonstration, only to find subsequently that after the Guardian had produced a picture of a couple of people in jeans and t-shirts walking alongside a couple of police officers with their baton drawn, that what I had been told in the crowd, and what I had witnessed myself, which was people in plain clothes being let through the police cordon when everyone else was being kettled, was in fact undercover officers. Now, admittedly, they're undercover officers from the City of London Police, and I had asked the Metropolitan Police, but it was interesting. The Metropolitan Police answer was that we would never deploy plainclothes officers in a crowd because it was far too dangerous. Well, the City of London didn't seem to have any difficulties with doing that. But so anyway, that was a slightly different angle on the G20 that I had compared to what was focused on in the Heywood book. But obviously his role was much more important than mine, and he had a much a global story, or Suzanne Heywood had a global story to tell about what was happening at that time at the G20.
She did have a global story, and comparing it to The Promised Land, which I read earlier this year, I found what is a major player from perhaps our line of view, and how dismissive, nice but a bit dull is how we're, the Brits were normally described by Obama, well-meaning but essentially clueless until they were knocked in line by his charisma. And I thought, fair enough. What is large in one world is small in another. I'm just going to say to everyone else, do jump in. We're being unusually quiet. We normally have a slew of questions. I know it was a harder book than usual. How about this? How about this? For those who may not have read it, you know, no telling off here. I imagine you would recommend the book, Tom.
Absolutely. If you want to get a sort of compressed history of the last 30 years of politics, understand a bit about the different personalities involved, see it from probably what is a less biased perspective than you would do from a politician, then this is very definitely the book to read. And as you were saying, I mean, you finished it a few minutes before. It also has if you can finish reading the book without a tear in your eye, then you're a tougher man than I am, because it was, you know, it's quite distressing at the end to hear how in the last 3 months of his life he was fighting cancer, and he found out the diagnosis of lung cancer. He found it out, went to bed, and that evening Grenfell Tower caught fire. So the next morning, having learnt that he had lung cancer the night before, he then had to go into the office first thing to try to sort out the problem, which some of you will remember, that Theresa May had gone to visit the site, but the police hadn't let her talk to any of the residents because they were worried about security. But that had immediately backfired, because it looked as though she was, you know, she didn't want to talk to those who'd been most directly affected. And so he, the next day, walks into that with the knowledge that, you know, his health condition is very bad, and he carried on working until he could no longer function, including working in bed, taking phone calls, whilst at the same time undergoing first of all sort of chemo and radiotherapy, and then actual operations, and then turning up at work the next day to try to resolve some of the thorny Brexit related issues, such as I mean, he identified early on that Northern Ireland was going to be the biggest stumbling block, and of course he was right. Another thing that people will find if they read the book is that there's a certain repetitiveness in the types of problems that come up in governments. He refers to, or Suzanne Heywood refers to, what he used to call smelly rats, which is a government policy that is apparently low key, apparently doesn't really affect many people, but has the potential, if someone doesn't trap it, to blow up in the government's face. And his first example was a plan to change the classification of Jaffa cakes from, I think, a cake to a biscuit. That move was blocked, I believe, I think from the book. But of course, if you think of later on George Osborne and the pasty tax, that would be perhaps one of the smelly rats that managed to get through Jeremy Heywood's sort of sieve in terms of policies that governments shouldn't put forward. And another point that he makes, which again is quite easily forgotten, is the length of time some of these decisions take to work their way through the system. So the decision about the 2 aircraft carriers, Queen Elizabeth and Prince of Wales, was taken in 2007, and the Prince of Wales aircraft carrier finally went into service. It was commissioned in 2019, so a 12-year duration from agreeing to do it to actually having it deployed. And along the way, multiple interventions from Jeremy Heywood to try to get ministers to agree whether this was going to be an aircraft carrier that planes could land on, or whether they were going to have to use vertical takeoff because they couldn't fit the wires that you need to slow the plane down if it's going to land, as opposed to vertical takeoff. And civil servants are often maligned for being yes minister types, but it's clear that in that process, he and other civil servants were working very hard just to try to get the government to make a decision, and it flip-flopped backwards and forwards. At one point, they were going to put wires on it so that the planes could land, come down and land on it, because they were being told by the MOD, which doesn't come out very well, I think, of this, the book, were being told by the MOD that it was fine, they could just tweak the aircraft carrier, it wasn't a problem. And subsequently, further research confirmed that basically they should, if they're going to do that, they're going to have to scrap it. What was what they came up with. So eventually they ended up back with a vertical takeoff capacity. So it's worth remembering how long these decisions take to work their way through the system. That's perhaps a very good example of that.
And it was also amazing just what a constant state of crisis number 10 was in, when Pat, you were much closer than any of us to the action, Tom, but when you're just a citizen reading the news, it's easy to perhaps, you have your own troubles in your daily life. It's easy to put the news aside for a short time and think, get caught up in your own life. But in a constant state of all sorts of scandals waiting to happen, or
yes, and you don't know what is going to be a scandal. There's no way that George Osborne knew that the pasty tax was going to blow up in his face, and there's no way that in coalition, for instance, the proposals which were described as selling off our forests, which weren't actually selling off our forests, they were putting them in a trust, if I remember correctly what the proposal was, but it was described as selling off our forests, and it built up a momentum that nobody had anticipated, and eventually required the government to do a U-turn, because the scale of protest was such that even though the policy wasn't actually going to do what was alleged it was going to do, it was less painful to do a U-turn and simply abandon the proposal, or at least come forward with something people found palatable, than it was to pursue something which was being portrayed in a way that wasn't wholly accurate, but was causing the government a huge amount of pain.
Right. Well,
and if ever people ask me, give me an example of where a petition makes a difference, that will be an example where the scale of protest through petitions was such that the government had to do a U-turn.
He was very good at pointing out where action should be made in a proactive manner. Perhaps this is because he's a civil servant, and it was he's compassionate to his family. He's devoted to the principles of an impartial civil service, and he makes that clear throughout. But it was far harder to work out his character and what it might be like meeting him than if, when you get an autobiography or biography written of a politician, they're especially a prime minister or president, their character's meant to jump off the page, and you've seen them in action, whereas he's often described as the most powerful person or the most important person you've never heard of. Whereas I found it quite hard to maybe get that sense of character.
I suppose what he wanted to do with the book is take his persona as a civil servant to the grave with him.
Yeah.
He could have gone for the cheap shots, I'm sure, at politicians' expense. He could have reeled off any number of embarrassing stories involving politicians, indecisiveness on the part of politicians, U-turns where in one meeting they might have argued one thing and then in the other they argued the opposite. He could, I'm sure, have reeled off a big long list of these, but chose not to. And there may be some examples in the book, but I'm struggling to think of anything that really that would land in terms of if you look at, say, Alan Duncan's book, which I think is being trailed in the Daily Mail at the moment, he has on every other page put something that he can guarantee is going to make the Daily Mail for that day, because it's something about well, a lot of criticism of Boris Johnson, for instance, that will certainly get coverage, and Jeremy Heywood clearly chose to not to do that, and that's very much in keeping with his role as a civil servant. That is presumably why he was able to hold the trust of all of those politicians. And it would be a bit strange if throughout his life as a civil servant, where he had managed to maintain a persona and act in a way that meant that he was trusted by a whole series of prime ministers from different parties, if he had then decided to write a book that was going to be highly critical of politicians. I mean, in terms of his personality,
yeah,
you can go, as I was listening before this call, listening to Jeremy 1961. If you go onto Spotify and type in Jeremy 1961, you can listen to his playlist, which I guess 1961 is the year where he was born. So I was born in 62. So a lot of the tracks that he enjoys are ones that I would enjoy, and I'll listen to his Spotify list again. So that tells you a little bit about that. But his personality comes across in his drive. I mean, the drive that he had to work in what must have been the most highly pressured role, probably more so even potentially than the prime minister, and to do that through 4 or 5 prime ministers is astonishing, really. And that I think says something about his character in terms of the commitment, his energy, and towards the end, the fact that he was clearly willing to perhaps jeopardize his own health because he thought his place should be trying to help Theresa May find a way through Brexit, for instance, even though by then he was clearly physically, even though initially nothing was diagnosed, he had a series of tests, but there was clearly something from a health perspective that was wrong. But even once it was diagnosed, and even after he'd had a series of operations, he was still willing to go into the office the next day, even if he was suffering from nausea.
Yeah, it's such a work ethic, I think, unlike one I've ever come across. Well, because of our unusual reticence, we normally, I think I'm going to put this down to a difficult book picked. So I will
tell me what other books have you chosen then? Maybe you should tip me off. Maybe I should have gone for.
Well, we've had a range. So what did we have? We had Ian Dunt last month joined us with his 2020 bestseller, How to Be a Liberal, which was, I suppose, lengthy, but written as a journalist might write set pieces of history, and with histories of monarchs having their heads lopped off here and there, it sort of wrote itself. We've had Majid the month before with his what is it? It was a manifesto. It was his manifesto for change. And then we had, we jumped around a bit. We had Ed Davey himself with Seeing Green back in November, and December we had Emma Hardy, who is my MP here in Hull, and she chose a book of fiction for us, which was I'm struggling with titles here. Something, The Chrysalids. So we've had a range, but I think this has been our. I have to say, I started off, and it was for me. I was born in '94, so starting in '92, it was history, and then it became all these proto-political experiences I had growing up. Tony Blair was the prime minister. He was, the prime minister of my primary, and and as I read through the chapters, I started to, yes, I actually do remember this one more and ever more. I remember this, this issue, this problem. And as I'm the Lib Dem campaign manager in Hull, and it was great to see the, Ed Davey and team for try and fight through. I think Ed Davey comes across well. I was surprised. I did have to check for all the sort of in the index to see where the other cabinet members, had I missed them out or not. What did I thought, a book starting with the intricacies of the ERM was maybe a tough one to sink my teeth into, but you adapt to his way of dealing with problems and thinking, and he deals with his problems with an immense sort of limitless pool of adaptability, and from the I don't know if from the photos in it, a certain level of suavity as well, especially on holiday,
Yeah, well, I guess that's when I was going to say that's when he could let his hair down, but in practice he didn't, because his phone was going constantly. In terms of things that surprised me about the book, it was interesting first of all, Gordon Brown, history will be kinder, I think, is what you should read into Jeremy Heywood's book, because Gordon Brown's initiative in 2008 was what probably stopped the world going into a Great Depression, and the actions that were taken here, which were then picked up by the governments, including Obama, for instance, helped stop that depression. So I think Gordon Brown will come out in 20 or 30 or 40 years' time better from a historical point of view than he is currently perceived. One perhaps counter argument to that is Jeremy Heywood refers to the fact that Gordon Brown did need to consult a lot of people when he needed to make a decision, and the only way that they could get him to make a decision was to write into the draft of a speech that he was going to give a policy initiative that they wanted him to approve. And as long as he ticked off the speech, they said, great, that's it, and obviously gave the speech. Once he'd given the speech, then that was policy. And that's the way that they managed to get things through. As Jeremy Heywood points out, the difficulty is that if what they were trying to get him to agree was a policy in relation to agriculture, and the speech he was going to be giving was in relation to the finance sector, it was quite hard to work it into the speech, the draft, for him to sign it off and get the policy officially through the system. So that was interesting. The other thing that was interesting that maybe it was said at the time, but I couldn't recall, was that in 2008 with Northern Rock and the potential for basically money to run out, that they were seriously considering having to put the troops on the street if people were going to be queuing up outside building societies and banks and failing to access funds. They were so worried about the potential anarchy that might be come with that they might have to put the troops on the street. So those are some things that I learned from the book, which sort of struck me as being not necessarily much talked about at the time. And you can see that the government of the day wouldn't want to be too openly talking about the prospect of putting troops on the street, although that was also considered as a response to the threat or the actual tanker driver strike, of getting troops involved and training troops to keep the oil flowing so that the economy didn't grind to a halt.
Well, I might do an awkward segue on grinding to a halt, unless there are any hands being raised now. Or forever hold your peace, asking your questions of Tom. I'm gonna ask.
Ask a question. Obviously, standards in public life have just become big news over.
You might need to come a bit closer to the microphone.
Oh, my apologies.
Obviously, standards in public life have been in the news the last few days with Greensill Capital and so on. What would Jeremy think about this?
Jeremy, I hope, would have been thinking at the time, as I have been, that the ministerial code was highly defective and needed to be strengthened, because that is at least part of the problem. So yes, David Cameron probably hasn't broken the rules. I'm confident the inquiry will find that he, basically because there aren't really any rules, he hasn't broken them. But what has happened, in my view, is that ministers, Rishi Sunak, Matthew Hancock, Jesse Norman, et al., they have either failed to do what they're required to do through the ministerial code, which is to report on the meetings that they were having with David Cameron. And I would argue that a meeting can be a face-to-face meeting, a Zoom call with the video on, or the Zoom call with the video off, or a phone call, or a text message. That's my definition of a meeting. And if my definition is correct, then they have broken the rules, because they have failed to report this lobbying, not only from David Cameron, but presumably any number of other ex-ministers. I think I read in the paper there's something like 80 ex-Conservative MPs who are now gone into lobbying of some sort, or businesses in-house lobbying, or lobbyists. So potentially they have all been ringing ministers on their mobile phones or texting them, asking them to do things, and not a single one of these contacts has been reported. So either they have been breaking the rules consistently, or the ministerial code is completely defective, has this classification of meeting, which is a face-to-face meeting, but anything else, doesn't matter whether you're an in-house lobbyist or a professional lobbyist. If you're calling the minister on the phone, it's fine. No one's going to report it, because the ministerial code doesn't require you to. So that is very definitely something to address. I think the other thing that Jeremy Heywood, I'm sure would be, I hope would be outraged about, is double jobbing of what hopefully is one senior civil servant who has taken it upon himself to continue in a role that he had previously, whereas other civil servants, I'm pretty confident, won't have done that. So I hope there's one rotten apple in the barrel, and not a series of them. But that has got to be clarified so that there's no doubt about it. The ministerial code, in my view, has got to be strengthened. I was involved in a story the Mirror did yesterday around Lords passes. So Lords, the rules about lobbying are weaker in the Lords. I mean, a member of Parliament can't lobby. That's very clear. Although I'm going to caveat that, give you an example of what is apparently okay, is Alan Cairns, Conservative Member of Parliament, gets paid to be a strategic advisor to a taxi firm. He is also on the all-party parliamentary group for taxis. Now, all-party parliamentary groups are set up for one reason. They're set up to lobby government on the issue that the APPG has been set up for. So the APPG on taxis will undoubtedly, otherwise there doesn't seem to be any purpose for them as an organisation, be lobbying government ministers around different aspects of the taxi industry. Now that apparently is okay. Strategic advice is different to lobbying. Well, personally, I think that needs to be tightened up in terms of clarity. So the Lord's Pass issue is people who work in the Lords, who have a Lord's Pass, Lords can't do it, but the people who work for them can register a lobbying activity. And that, again, is something which, in my view, has got to change. We can't have people circulating using the privilege that is provided to them by a parliamentary pass, which means they can move freely and meet with any number of MPs and peers in House of Commons or House of Lords. If they're lobbying, then they should not have that advantage. I don't have a problem with lobbying, but as long as it's transparent. But I do have a problem where certain people have a huge advantage in terms of their lobbying, plus they're not being transparent about it.
Thank you.
Okay. Edward, you've just come in, but we're sort of saying goodbye to Tom. My last question, really, in Unlock Democracy's roadmap to a written constitution, what are the next steps, and what might be a call to action that we might be able to do as individuals here?
Well, first of all, we are realistic that a full frontal campaign for a written constitution is quite a hard sell. Mm. So what we are trying to do is we are trying to sort of describe a written constitution as it's an insurance policy. That's what it is. So in other words, it's an insurance policy that guarantees that a prime minister can't shut down parliament because it's being inconvenient and doesn't agree with what he wants to do. It's a guarantee that a written constitution would lock in power. So if there's an agreement between local councils and central government about the distribution of power between the two, a written constitution is the guarantee that a government can't come in unless it secures a 2/3 or greater majority and completely tear up that settlement. And the same would apply equally, we would hope, in relation to the devolutionary settlement between the UK and Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. Actually, how you get to written constitution, that is a real challenge. Other countries have successfully done it. So Chile is in the process of sort of revising theirs, and they're using a citizens assembly to do that, and that is something that we would like to see sort of front loaded. We had thought there was going to be an opportunity to campaign on this, because in the Conservative manifesto in 2019 they did promise in effect a constitutional refresh, but eventually sort of backed off that idea and have instead come forward with individual measures such as looking at judicial review. Labour, and this is where we could get some traction, Keir Starmer in December made a speech and talked about a constitutional reform, talked about devolution. It was particularly in relation to Scotland that's what he was focusing on, but then appointed Gordon Brown to work up the initial stages of this proposal. So it does seem as though within the Labour Party there is an appetite to look at this. So our best route in is, and this is something that Unlock Democracy are going to be applying for funding for, working with other organisations, or possibly other organisations in the plural, an initiative that would campaign for a wide sort of constitutional reform agenda, perhaps PR at the heart of it and at the head of it, which could then lead into, as part of that package, a written constitution. The move, as hopefully you may have noticed, the move within the Labour Party for PR is building up momentum. And they have got, I don't know what the current count is, something like 210 or 215 constituency Labour parties have now passed motions that call for Labour to either adopt PR or investigate PR. So that's a good step. As I understand it, the Momentum conference that was held a couple of weeks ago They chose a PR related motion as their second choice. So that looks as though that's going to get a lot of traction as well. So the way we're going to get a written constitution is principally by working with the Labour Party, who we think may have an appetite for this. Obviously, the Lib Dems have and the Green Party have, and see if we can create a coalition that would be large enough come the next general election for this to be a centrepiece of an offer from the different parties, the progressive parties within that coalition, to then push that constitutional reform agenda and finish what really sort of Cook McLennan started back in 1997 with the which ended up being what Labour implemented in 1997 with Scottish Parliament, Welsh Assembly, powers going back to London. But this constitutional reform agenda should pick up on things like a fair voting system, making sure the Prime Minister can't close down Parliament, and critically, I think critically for the future of the United Kingdom, and this is saying this in a personal capacity, a devolution settlement that would move us to a federal system, which is the only real prospect I think we have of keeping the United Kingdom together. Interestingly, some of the very prominent SNP MPs were previously supporters of a federal settlement, but because that's never happened, they've now moved on to independence. Personally, I think that would be catastrophic for the United Kingdom. At the very least, what it would guarantee is a heightening of tension between those who are in favour and those who are against independence, very much modelled on Brexit in terms of the tension that created within North-South in the UK, older and younger people within families and so on. That I can't see how you could avoid replicating that if Scotland moves to independence. And I think this is one of the weaknesses of the argument for independence, all of the problems that have been derived or have come out of Brexit are ones that will apply if Scotland leaves the United Kingdom as well. Border issues, tariff issues, everything will be replicated, but it will probably be harder because we're more integrated than we were with the European Union. So that's why I think a federal settlement with more powers for Scotland, more powers for Wales, more powers for Northern Ireland, a big question mark clearly about what you do about England, because you couldn't, if you end up, for instance, with an English Parliament, which is obviously something that people have advocated, then it's not clear how you would ensure that federation worked effectively, because England would still be overwhelmingly the bulk of the federation, so to speak. So I'm not sure how you manage that. Clearly, it has to be managed in a way that I haven't identified what the solution is at present. But so that's what the written constitution could include, and would provide guarantees around future actions that a government could not take unless they commanded 2/3 majority in the House for it to happen.
Well, thank you very much.